In this video, we're going to learn about the 4 exposure principles to filmmaking. These are the fundamental principles for operating really any camera. If you can understand these settings and put them into practice confidently, you'll be able to film in any circumstance without having to ask someone what settings they use. In fact, hello?
Yeah, hey, what are your settings for filming indoors at night?
Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is... Hello?
Hey, real quick, what settings should I use if I'm filming on a cloudy day?
Rather than giving you the momentary easy answers, let's explore the 4 exposure principles of filmmaking. If this is your first time here, my name is Spencer Fackrell. I'm an aspiring filmmaker making videos really since I was in elementary school. I've traveled the world, worked on all sorts of projects, and I'm here now to share some of the things I've learned along the way. And here's the thing, we're always learning, we're always growing. So if you're just starting out with this whole making videos and stuff, I hope to be a friendly guide to help you out. Anyways, welcome. It's nice to have you here. When I first started making videos, I had no idea what dials did what. If my image was too bright and I cranked a dial one way to make it darker, that was good enough for me. But this approach was just sloppy because I didn't know how to use my camera. I wasn't really in control of it, rather, it was in control of me. And as a filmmaker, you want to maintain as much control as possible so that your end result is a product of intention. That's not to say accidents aren't welcome, they totally are. It's just nice to understand how you got there and how you can repeat it. With that said, these 4 principles are the foundation to understanding and properly adjusting your exposure in filmmaking. You see, exposure is the total amount of light coming into your sensor. If everything's blown out and white, this is called overexposed. If things are too dark, this is called underexposed. To adjust your exposure, you'll use a mixture of shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and an ND filter for you filmmakers. And in my experience, I found that these work in a hierarchical fashion. They build off of one another. Let me show you what I mean. First, shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time your sensor is exposed to light. This value is expressed as a fraction of a second. Once you've decided what frame rate to film in, and if you're not sure what frame rates are or how they work, I made a video about it which you can watch here. Anyways, once you've decided what frame rate to film in, you'll want to set your shutter speed to double its value. This is called the 180-degree rule. This rule in filmmaking is all about achieving the most natural looking motion blur. Basically, if you're filming in 24 frames, you'll set your shutter speed to 1/50. If it's 30 frames, 1/60. 60 frames, 1/125, and so on. If the shutter speed isn't exactly double the value of your frame rate, that's okay. Just use the closest value. Doing this keeps your footage looking natural to the eye. The reason we don't adjust our shutter speed willy-nilly is because it affects the way our video looks. Filming with a faster shutter speed of say 1/2000 or 1/4000 will make your footage look jittery and action-packed, sort of like a fight scene in Jason Bourne. Filming with a slower shutter speed value of 1/5 or 1/10 will make your footage look dreamy, giving it a sort of ghosting effect. So that's why we have the 180-degree rule. In most circumstances, having your shutter speed double the frame rate is the way to go. And if you decide not to, at least you'll know why your footage looks action-packed or dreamy. Second is aperture. Aperture is the opening in your lens which allows light to hit the sensor. The bigger the opening, the more light comes in, and the same is true in reverse. The smaller the opening, the less light can come in. This is expressed as an f-stop value. f1.8 is a bigger opening and will let in more light compared to something like f16 or f22. Aperture also controls the depth of field in your image. The lower the number, the more blurry your background will be. If you were to look at a profile view of what's in focus, it would be very thin at f1.8. Just a small part of the scene is sharp. and everything else falls quickly out of focus. At f22, that focused area would be much thicker, meaning more of the scene appears sharp from foreground to background. So depending on the style you're going for, you'll set your aperture value and move on to the next setting, which is ISO. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. Higher ISO values are more sensitive and make your image brighter. The trade-off is that when your ISO is really high, you'll begin to see noise in your image. Some cameras are better at maintaining a cleaner image at higher ISO values than other cameras. The general rule of thumb here is that the lower the ISO, the better your image will look. But if your scene is really dark, you may not have much of a choice, and you might just have to crank your ISO. These three principles, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, are what are called the exposure triangle. And this is what we use to adjust our exposure, or the total amount of light that hits our sensor. And if you're just taking photos, these are the settings you use to alter your exposure. But video gets an extra variable because it's kind of awesome like that. It's called an ND filter, which is basically like sunglasses for your camera. This one is what's called a variable ND filter. When you rotate the front element here, the polarized glass alters the amount of light that comes into your camera. You can screw one of these onto the front of your lens by referencing the filter thread diameter here. From there, you'll be able to adjust the amount of light coming into your camera simply by rotating it. Just be aware that if you twist it to go as dark as possible, it'll create these artifacts on the edges. ND filters also exist as solid panes of tinted glass. These tend to be more expensive and fit in what's called a matte box. And there you go. Those are the 4 exposure principles of video. And if you can master them, practicing how to expose your shot in all sorts of circumstances, you'll be miles ahead of others just starting out. This is learning the ABCs of filmmaking and working a camera. Come on, let's go practice. First is deciding what frame rate we want to shoot in. For this example, let's keep things at 24 FPS. Next, we'll set our shutter speed to be double our frame rate, so 1/48 or 1/50. Then I'll move on to either aperture or ISO. This really comes down to what you value more, digital noise or a certain depth of field. For me, I generally go with aperture because this camera does a pretty decent job with higher ISO values, but if it was a dark scene, you might go for ISO. So I'll set my aperture to 2.8, then I'll move on to my ISO and set that right here. It's still bright outside, so this is where that ND filter comes in. By screwing this on and then rotating it to the right position, I can see that my exposure is right where it should be. I can tell that it's in the right spot by looking at this, the exposure meter. When it's close to 0, my camera is saying that what's in frame here looks properly exposed. And for those who know about picture profiles, this is filmed in just a natural picture profile. We're not filming in log here. That's something for another video. You can also just use your eyes to determine what looks good, but these meters and numbers are here to help. And there we go. Let's try one more example though, but this time I'll start out with some of the settings not quite where I want them to be, and then I'll show you how to fix it. Let's say I want to film in this dark garage, and I want to film at 24 frames per second. But hold on, I want you to pause and see what stands out to you here. That's right, our shutter speed, aperture, and ISO are all over the place. Let's try to fix it by first setting the shutter speed to double the frame rate. Let's open the aperture, let as much light in as possible, and then let's raise the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive to light, ultimately making our image brighter. But it's still dark, and that's because we have an ND filter on. Let's take those sunglasses off, and there we go. Filmmaking is unpredictable, and learning how to set your exposure properly will replace feeling flustered or confused with feelings of confidence that you're doing it right. Now that you know the principles, go out and practice. Experiment by setting things up wrong and fixing them based on what you learned in this video. And if you need to watch it again and take notes, that might be helpful. Go do that. Anyways, my name is Spencer Fackrell. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.